Hi. Akai's MPK Mini Plus pushes forward the trend we've been seeing in recent years of MIDI controllers increasingly having more and more brains. It has a built-in arpeggiator and simple polyphonic sequencer with linked key and drum tracks, each capable of being sent to different MIDI channels, giving you control of up to 3 hardware and software instruments at a time. On top of that, it also has MIDI and CV I/O if you want to control hardware synths and drum machines. And on the software side, it has integrations with MPC Beats, Ableton Live, and others promised in the future. In this video, I'll take a look at all the hardware and software control elements of MPK Mini Plus, an in-depth look at how it works, and pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Akai sent MPK Mini Plus over for review, no money changed hands, and as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my bonus content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Before we get into the details, I want to talk a bit about this setup because it's a good example of how you can control both hardware and software instruments. I've got the MPK Mini Plus, and I'm going to call it Mini Plus from now on, connected to a computer via USB. This way I can get my little note animations going and control both hardware and software. And I've also got a sustain pedal under the table so I can hold notes and go about my business doing other things. Mini Plus can send information on a few channels at once. You've got the keyboard, which also includes the arpeggiator, and that's sending information currently on MIDI channel 1, and that's going to a pad on Wavetable Synth in Ableton Live. The pads control a 909 kit, and in the intro I had note repeat on, and the pads perform nicely and respond to pressure. That's being sent out on MIDI channel 10, and the pads also have a sequence programmed into them. And I can play on top of that sequence with note repeats. And the second track, the key track, is sending MIDI through my computer to EastBeast through an off-camera MIDI interface. You can also use the Mini Plus as a MIDI interface. I just preferred to have one less cable in the frame as long as I'm routing MIDI through my computer. The drum and key sequencer are linked tracks, so they have to be the same length, the same swing, the same speed, but they are independent in the sense that they go out on separate channels. And like I mentioned earlier, the key sequence goes out channel 3, this goes out channel 10, and I can play on top of that with the keyboard going out on channel 1. So that's a pretty impressive feat for a small keyboard at this price. The mod wheel is mapped to the filter cutoff in Ableton Live and just does a light show using CV to this module. And then finally I've got analog clock to time the delay in Ghost so that it's in sync. I've also got EastBeast going through this for compression and for reverb. And yeah, you can set the delay times here so they're in sync. And that's pretty much the setup. So the first question you might ask about a budget controller is, how's the hardware? The enclosure is all plastic, but doesn't feel flimsy at all. Going from left to right, the pitch, bend, and mod wheels are plastic. They don't feel premium or anything like that, but considering the cost of the controller, it's great that they're there as opposed to touch strips on other controllers. I prefer physical controls. The joystick is very springy, so unlike the mod wheel, it's hard to control precisely with one hand, but if you sort of rest your palm or hand on the controller, it's easier to get more precise control both in the Y and X axis. The buttons are a bit clicky, but I like them. They respond well. The pads are sensitive both to velocity and, like I mentioned earlier, to pressure, which I think is very useful. They feel very much like the pads on more expensive MPCs, overall more on the heavy side compared to pads, say, by Native Instruments or Novation. There's no tool currently to configure the velocity curve for the pads, unlike there is for the keys, by the way. Hopefully they can add that here as well. You can change the color of the pads if you want and have them either trigger notes, program changes, or MIDI CCs. And you can also use them as a TR-style sequencer for every one of the tracks. That's a pretty neat trick. We'll get into that when we talk about the sequencer. One thing to note about the pads and the encoders, there's one bank of 8 encoders currently, but 2 banks of pads. So the first 8, and you can toggle between the banks using the bank button. Moving on down the right, the screen is OLED and viewable from any angle. It's very small, but certainly better to have it here than not. You can configure a lot of the internal behavior using Shift and Config, say for scales or for chords, or for the CV setup. The encoder has detents, so it's easy to select specific rows, and it's also a push encoder if you want to edit parameters. Then continuing to the right, you've got 8 endless encoders. They're smooth and don't have any detents, and I have to say I really like them. They don't feel cheap at all, and they're tuned very well to give you fine control if you want, but if you want coarse motions, you don't have to spin the knobs multiple times to get where you want to be. They don't have an LED ring, unlike some other controllers, but you do see the values on the screen on a graph and fairly large font. So that's the top half. Let's talk about the mini keys. I think velocity sensitivity is fairly good. I feel like they're very playable and there's good control of velocity. They are a bit cramped. Not all mini keys are created equal. So if I compare this to the mini keys on the KeyStep, you can see that the KeyStep 37 is about a key and a half wider, and its keys are maybe close to a centimeter or less than half an inch deeper as well. So that's the physical aspect of this controller. Let's take a look at connectivity. MPK Mini Plus is powered by USB. It can also send and receive MIDI over USB, and you can configure it using the program editor over USB as well. It also has a sustain pedal input, analog sync, input and output, and then pitch, CV, and gate outputs to control modular gear. This accepts MIDI, so I'm just controlling it using MIDI. Pitch sends CV over a 5-octave range, and the mod output can be either the mod wheel or velocity. The Mini Plus can also be used as a MIDI and MIDI to CV interface. You can choose which channel gets sent out the CV outputs, and when you connect it to a computer, the MIDI in and out are accessible as a separate port, the notes being sent from and to the controller. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at some of the brains of Mini Plus. It has an arpeggiator with actually 3 ways to control it, so take your pick. If I turn it on, so you can control it using these labeled keys. So say if I wanted to turn latch off, then I do it that way. And there are a few relative speeds and a few play orders, up, down, up and down, Stranger Things mode, the order you played, and random. And this continues with the usual suspects, octave ranges, up to 4 of them. Swing. When you activate swing here, by the way, it's also applied to any sequence running in parallel. You can set sync. And you also have access to all these parameters and more using the 8 encoders. And if you look at the labels under the encoders, you'll see what they do. So we already saw most of these before. Time division, swing, play mode and octaves. But we've got gate, which is a new one. So gate is note length, and maybe if we change a few parameters on each beast, it'll be more noticeable. And gate, like swing, also applies to the sequencer, to untied notes in the sequencer. And BPM is tempo control. And if you really wanted to menu dive your way through this, you could. So just Shift, Arp, Config, and scroll through these. But there's no reason to do that. If you want to set the arpeggiator channel, so right now I'm controlling He's Beast, but the Arpeggiator channel is the global channel of the keyboard. So hit Shift and Global and choose 1, and I'm back to controlling the computer. Moving on, the MPK Mini Plus has a simple polyphonic sequencer with keyboard and drum tracks. The keyboard track has up to 8 note polyphony, and the drum track, I think you can trigger all 16 notes, so that's 16 note polyphony on the drum track. The tracks are linked, meaning that they both need to have the same length, up to 64 steps, and both run at the same relative speed, but they can each be sent out separate MIDI channels, like I mentioned earlier, also separate from the Arpeggiator. By the way, while the keyboard and drum tracks do run at the same rate, so if you change one, you'll be changing the other, the Arpeggiator track doesn't. So I can configure its time division, say to have it run slower. And same goes for the note repeat. So if I wanted to, I can configure it to run at a separate time division than the Arpeggiator or the sequencer. Anyway, so to sequence, you can either step sequence or sequence live. I'll clear both tracks so we have them empty. If you want to edit the length of both tracks, you do that in the menu here. Let's keep it at 16, though I could make it, like I mentioned, up to 64 steps. But we're going to stay at 16. So to sequence, you just go step by step and add notes to it. And you can also move through the steps like this, which is easier, so you don't really need to use this menu. You can add up to 8 notes per step. You toggle notes by just tapping them again. Since this is a monophonic instrument, we'll just make this monophonic. I'll clear this. And let's quickly add the sequence. Okay. So that's my sequence. And then you sequence drums exactly the same way. So say if I wanted a kick on this step, just add it here. And I can move through the steps and add, add more kicks or snares or whatever, wherever I wanted. So if you get that, let's clear this. Punching in steps, by the way, is velocity sensitive. Now, there's another way to step sequence the drums, and that's actually done in the live sequence menu or mode. So you hit live sequence, and then you make sure that this menu item has step sequencing into it as opposed to live. And then the pads become a TR style sequencer. So you choose what you want to sequence, which drum you want to sequence using Shift. Let's say I want to sequence the kick. So if I wanted just simple 4 on the floor, I'd put here in the first 8 steps. Then the bank button gets you to steps 9 through 16. And you've got a pattern of kicks. And you can delete them as well. Go back to the other bank. And the velocity matters here. So that's going to be a strong kick. And then say if I wanted to add this here, another strong kick here, but maybe light kicks here. For sort of like ghost notes. That works really nicely. Then I could go to any other instrument. I see it doesn't preview when a pattern is playing. Here we go. So say hi-hats. Anyway, just add hi-hats at various velocities here. And that's how you step sequence TR style. So those are the basics of step sequencing. Aside from that, you can record live into both the drums and the key patterns. For that, I need to go into live mode. If you want to practice before you record, just hit home and play what you want without recording. And this will work better if I turn off note repeat. Then if I want to record, just hit Shift, live sequence, and then record live. A few more odds and ends. If I'm in step mode, and say I add to step 1 something I don't want, all of these, let's say, then you can undo steps like that. But if you're in live mode and you want to erase notes you don't want in the pattern, you hold Shift and the pads you want to remove, and it works kind of like an erase head. And if I say clear this pattern, the key pattern, you can also record live using the keyboard, but it doesn't record ties, at least not in the current firmware. But there's a way around this. If I want to create a tie, make sure I'm in step sequencing mode, find the step that I want to tie, erase any steps I don't want with a double tap. Anyway, hold the step and then press the next button for as long as you want the note to be tied. One thing I know you're going to ask about sequencing, this doesn't support micro timing, so everything is quantized to the grid, though there is swing, so swing doesn't apply just to the ARP. It applies to the key and drum sequencer as well. And then there's one more noteworthy sequencing feature. If you turn on Transpose, then if you press home, you're controlling whatever the keyboard controls, but if you go back into editing the sequence, you're no longer adding notes, rather you're transposing the sequence. So that's pretty much it for sequencing. Let's press home, take a look at a few other features like scales and chords. You can assign scales to the keyboard, shift config, and you can turn the mode on or off, and then choose the scale. So chromatic is all the notes, but if you choose, say, a major scale, then whatever you play, you'll play in scale. And then I'll turn this off. For chord mode, you've got, again, shift, config, a few chord types. I think there's 6 of these. It would be nice if you can configure your own chords, but you can't. There's no custom option currently. And then you can choose the key, the scale, and the inversion option. Here we go. First, second, third. That works with shift. In both scales and chords, by the way, you can choose to ignore notes that are played outside the scale or just to snap them to the scale. That's pretty much what you need to know about scales and chords. Note repeat, we talked about this earlier. It's cool with swing too, by the way. Anyway, you can configure it holding shift and config. I think we spoke about all these things. Diving in a little bit deeper, you can actually configure quite a bit of what's going on here. If you hold shift and program select, then if you touch the pads, you can configure what they do, which is either send out notes, program changes, or control changes. And then for either of those, you can choose what that will be. So which note, which control change, which program change. There's a toggle mode, and you can also choose their colors, both on or off. So when you press them and when you don't. Then same goes for the joystick, X-axis, Y-axis, and same goes also for the encoders, which CC, high and low values, absolute or relative. So very nice and quick to configure all of these. You can't, by the way, currently configure a different channel for each pad. They all go out the same channel, at least as of the current firmware. You can, however, change that channel in the live sequence mode. Let's keep this at 10. Once you have everything set up the way you like, you can store and recall the machine state in one of 8 different memory slots called programs here. So I messed up my intro pattern, just hold program select and choose one of the patterns and you can load it. So everything that's stored, which is cool. The one thing that I'd like for them to add here is currently you can swap patterns while a pattern is playing, but they swap immediately. So let's say if I go to pattern 5, program 5, I've got to do it precisely at the right time. Otherwise, they'll just swap immediately. So it would be nice if there would be some form of quantization here so that there would be an option to wait for a pattern to finish before it swaps to the next program. Akai has also developed a program editor, so if you prefer to use that to set program parameters, you can, including editing the sequences if you want. There's no live sync between the software and the controller, so you need to go and say get the program, let's say get program 6, And we now have my wonderful pattern here, both for the drums and for the keys. So it's pretty easy to send these back and forth, and you can also save them to your hard disk and load them up. Almost all of these parameters are available on the controller itself, so you don't really need to bother with this a lot unless you really want to. Unless I missed something, there are only really two things you can do here that you can't on the controller, which is rename the programs and edit the keyboard velocity curve. Let's talk about software compatibility. MPK Mini Plus has an integration with Akai's own free DAW MPC Beats. You can use the keys under the knobs for transport control, as you'd expect. The pads control the first 16 pads. The encoders act as Q-Link controls, as you'd expect. Very smooth and nice. I guess the only comment I'd have here is, first, you only control the bottom 8 parameters, not the top ones. It would be nice if you could use the shift bank or something to control the top 8 parameters. And it would be natural, I think, if the rows were swapped. So I know these are the first encoders and these are the sort of second 4. But you can really easily swap those manually by editing the template like I showed you earlier. Just swap the CCs. Aside from controlling MPC's own Beats software, a beta of their integration with Ableton Live was available for me to test. Similar to the Beats software, you've got control over the cursor here. Play, stop, record. The pads are mapped to the default 16 pads. There's no control over the session grid, but you can, of course, say, for example, map these pads manually to trigger any clips. And what I'm quite fond of, you have control of the parameters in the active device. So say if I go to a different track. So pretty cool that you can control the active device. So that's MPK Mini Plus. Let's talk about pros and cons. Arturia's KeyStep pioneered the segment of mini key controllers within Arpeggiator, sequencer, MIDI, and CV outputs, and they had a lot of success with that, rightfully so. It's nice to see a company throw its hat in the ring, not just by copying and cloning, but by innovating and adding value, and all of that at a very affordable price, relatively speaking. The pros for MPK Mini Plus are, I think, the 8 encoders. They work really nicely, the 8 velocity and pressure-sensitive pads, the physical mod and pitch bend wheels, and the joystick if you want to use that. The keybed is slightly more cramped and shorter and doesn't have Aftertouch, but its velocity works really nicely. Aside from that, another major pro for MPK Mini Plus is the fact that you can use both the arpeggiator and the sequencer simultaneously, and the fact that it has the 2 sequencer tracks, both drums and keys, even though they're linked and need to run at the same speed and have the same length. The fact that you have 2 sequences at the arpeggiator and note repeats, all again for the price that this goes for, is pretty impressive. In terms of cons, I can think of a lot of things that this doesn't do. The question is, what can you get at the same price? And the answer is, I don't think much. So yes, it doesn't have micro timing. It doesn't have automation of CC parameters. You can't run the drum and key tracks at different time divisions, but feel free to let me know in the comments section if you know of anything else that does at this price. Overall, I found this very stable, except for a couple bugs that I reported to Akai. Hopefully these will be fixed soon. Then I think other things to consider: if you only work with a computer and don't need all the hardware integration, an onboard sequencer and arpeggiator may not be that important for you, because most DAWs have that. If you're only working with a computer, Novation's Launch Key series has a better integration with Ableton Live, though at the time I'm making this, I only saw a beta of MPK's integration with Live, so maybe it'll also include clip launching. And then if you need a good integration with Native Instruments ecosystem, their controllers might work better for you, though again, without an arpeggiator, sequencer, or any of the I/O that this has. So tough decisions, and there's a lot to choose from, but kudos for Akai for raising the bar on what a MIDI keyboard does at this price range. So that's it for MPK Mini Plus. There's a whole synth and sequencer buyer's guide and much more in my ever-expanding book, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.